You are listening to Cursed Murphy's podcast. Our guest, Donegal-born poet, writer and educator Annemarie Ní Churreáin. Annemarie Ní Churreáin's first book, Bloodroot, published by Doire Press in 2017, was shortlisted for the Shine Strong Award for Best First Collection in Ireland and for the 2018 Julie Suk Award in the US. She's the recipient of numerous literary fellowships, including a residency at the Jack Kerouac House, Orlando. In 2016, Annemarie was the recipient of a Next Generation Artists Award from the Arts Council of Ireland. The following year, she was appointed to the Writers in Prisons panel, co-funded by the Arts Council and the Department of Justice, Equality and Reform. She is currently writer in residence at National University of Ireland, Maynooth. Of her work, Dr. Sinéad Kennedy of the Department of English there has written, Ní Churreáin bears witness to the lived experiences of women, including those Irish women who, for too long, have been overlooked and silenced. Women like Ann Lovett, Joanne Hayes, and the many nameless, disregarded women who lived lives of imprisonment within Irish institutions. The following episode, featuring Annemarie's most extensive interview to date, was produced with the support of Wexford Arts Department, Wexford County Council and Wexford Public Library, and was recorded in front of a live audience by Dan Comerford. Annemarie, you're very welcome to Cursed Murphy's podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for hosting this discussion.
How very formal.
I can't help but be formal.
It's a very interesting historical position of the poet is where, they're ignored for most of their lives to the point of starvation, and then when a president needs something to quote in his presidential address, they get sort of wheeled out and pillaged. A lot about your work seems to be a critiquing of the state, a rebellion against the state. Is there an element of poetry that involves revolt or not, wearing your suit and tie?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm really interested in what Joyce said, that all poetry is a revolt against actuality. And I didn't always realise that about my own voice and about my own work, but certainly once I looked at my first manuscript that would become my first book, I could no longer deny that there's something in the poems and there's something in me that naturally wants to push out, to push against, to speak up. And you kind of go on a journey of reflection and discovery when you're writing, and you discover yourself through the work. And my first book taught me a lot about who I was and where I've come from, where my family have come from. And
what's the bloodroot of the title?
So bloodroot is a wild plant. It doesn't grow in Ireland. I came across it when I was away from Ireland, away from home. It's a plant that is used as a healer. It has medicinal properties that can be used for healing wounds. And if used incorrectly, it can be really quite harmful. So I was interested really originally in the word bloodroot. I was interested in all the O's, all the space in the word. I just made up the word myself, and then I sat with it for a few months and I researched it, and I thought, is that word out there in the world? And I discovered this plant, and I remembered that I had connected with this wild plant when I was in part of the United States on residency. So the title is really significant for me because it speaks of wildness, it speaks of the landscape, it speaks of the potential for harm, potential for healing, and it's also a very good looking word, which is very important to me.
Did you know when you were writing these poems that there would be a sort of a thematic spine to them? I mean, a lot of the poems are to do with the suppressed voices of women, institutionalized women, women who were in mother and baby homes. And it was an incredibly timely book. It came out in 2017, right on the cusp of a lot of convulsions in Irish society, inevitable convulsions. And I wonder, was this book always mapped as a sort of manifesto? Is too strong a word, but there's a very strong line running through it.
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, I did my MPhil in creative writing in around 2010, and I really set out to write a book that would dig into the physical landscape and look at things like hair blower and Ogham and the wild landscape. And so I really had no idea that I was going to go on this journey into Irish history and the voices of rural Irish women, and that it would lead me to sit at the graveside of Ann Lovett, or that it would lead me to Carsavine Beach. I mean, I just kind of ended up down that road, really self-aware, and had to almost at one point in the writing put it all aside and think, do I want to continue going down this path? Because this is not what I had planned myself. And I certainly was just writing because I wanted to be writing in the aftermath of my MPhil, but I wasn't thinking of the political climate. I wasn't thinking there's a referendum going to come up, none of that. In fact, I think sometimes when you're making work and when you're being creative, if everything's going very well, natural synchronicities will emerge. And just after the book was published, Ann Lovett's story was back in the Irish Times again. And I think those synchronicities, they're a sign that you're on the right path. So I had, during the writing of Bloodroot, I did pause and I thought, do I want to continue going on with this? But I was learning so much about myself, and I was learning so much about my family, and it seemed really important to go on with the book, even though it was at times a very dark process, and there's a lot of fun and joy and play in writing a book, but there was a lot of excavating and looking at difficult subjects in this particular book.
A friend of mine quite recently, only half jokingly, referred to Ireland as an open air asylum. At what point did you discover, for instance, I mean, all of us have, we don't have skeletons in the cupboard, we have entire graveyards stuck in there. I wonder at what point did you discover, say, that your paternal grandmother was in a mother and baby home? And how much did that influence the poems, or did the poems come first?
I think that growing up in the family that I grew up in, I was always aware of the unsaid and the untold story, because I grew up with foster siblings. So I was in my own biological family, but had many foster siblings coming from all types of different backgrounds and staying in the family for various lengths of time. And so I was around a lot of unsaid, around a lot of unverbalized feeling, and around a lot of secrets. And so from a very young age, I think I was attuned to all of that. My ear was attuned to that, and I think I began reading body language and observing how people acted in different scenarios, and thinking about how families belong to each other and what happens when there's separation in a family. I started thinking about that at a very young age. And then at some point I became aware that maybe part of the reason that there was silence in our family past was because my father did not have any contact with his birth mother. And then, slowly, I mean, as kids, you're kind of unraveling stories. You kind of pull on a thread, and realised that my paternal grandmother, had given birth in a mother and baby home. She had become separated from my father for, over 40 years. And then suddenly the realisation at around age 12, 13, that we had a whole other family on the other side of the border in Derry, and that we might meet them. So you're kind of, like, I think we all put together our family stories, we unravel and we put together the picture. Kind of the two things are kind of happening at the same time, slowly and over time. But it was probably a pretty unique upbringing in that most of the people I ever lived with had been separated from their parents or siblings.
So you were a serial foster sister from what age?
From around the age of 11.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is your father still alive?
Yes, he is.
Do you speak to him about his family history?
We have spoken about it. It's probably been easier for me to write about it than it is to have those type of conversations. I feel like my writing comes out of an inability sometimes to have verbal conversations, and that I've been able to make sense of the situation and our family dynamic and our family constellation a lot more by writing about it. But yes, I've had family conversations where we talk about how that kind of past influences, our relationships today with each other, and it does influence how we talk to each other, how we carry information for each other, how we feel from when we're away from each other. Because that historical loss is kind of, I think it's embedded into your DNA. The idea that you could be left, that you might be left, that you might become displaced from everyone that you know and love. And I think as a country, we're really just beginning to examine all of that. I mean, where I come from in northwest Donegal, there was quite a tradition of children who have been born through the mother baby homes being fostered out or boarded out to help families, with farm or with the land as
a labour force.
Exactly, yeah. So, I can see those. I can see those men now who are fostered out and boarded out as young boys and as older men in the community. And I think that the impact has been huge, of that history on our lives today, and it's these things are intergenerational as well. We carry forward our sense of belonging from one generation into another, and
a writer in the family is a bloody inconvenience.
I feel for my family. I really do. I think having a writer in the family is like, having some kind of ticking time bomb. They might, they might say nothing for a long time, and then they're going to publish a book. And yet it's essential that somebody takes up the gauntlet and says, I'm going to break the silence. I'm going to say the thing that we're afraid to say. I'm going to talk about the thing that we'd all prefer not. That I think there's value in that. I don't apologise for that because I think it's very hard to write a book out of anything other than love and respect. I don't know if that's true of all literary genres, but all of my poetry and all of the poetry I admire, it comes out of a naturally compassionate and open and transformative place. I'd struggle to think of a poetry book that was written to kind of piss someone off or revenge or hurt, or like poetry is a naturally very careful, thoughtful, mindful type of writing, and what goes into a poem is often a lifetime of feeling.
I remember the first time I read Paul Durkin's Berlin Wall Cafe, which is essentially the anatomy of the dissolution of his marriage, and I must have been about 19 or 20, and I was kind of agog, aghast, and utterly blown away by his honesty, or the sort of forensic scrutiny of the dissolution of a relationship. And never thought at that age of the consequences or the right to reply, or the right to reply that can never be expressed or isn't expressed. Have your family commented on your work? Have they discussed it?
My family have never been to reading. I think it'd be very difficult, as it is, to face any family member who knows where you come from, knows your whole story, and to face their version of your truth. That said, I think I was really raised as a child to be vocal. I'm quite a naturally introverted person, I think, and quite formal, and I think we raise the children, and we raise the people that we want in our families, and like I have a sister who's a singer. All my brothers are involved in kind of making and crafting, and I certainly feel like I was allowed to become a writer. And
were there books in the house growing up?
No, there weren't books. It wasn't we're a rural family who lived in, we spoke Irish at home, and so there wasn't really any dearth of Irish language books. There wasn't a local library for a long time. It wasn't, I was the first person to go to college, so it wasn't a literary, arty household by a long stretch. But that said, my parents being in the situation in which they were, which was they had a large family and they were unskilled and had not had the opportunity to go to third level education. I think they were very good at making something out of almost nothing. And so, my father sold turf. He went out on the trawlers fishing. My mother knit iron jumpers and sold them. They sold produce. They sold, they had 300 chickens. They went through all the kind of difficulties that a family in the 80s with a large number of children and not much means to support them. They tried everything, and so I always grew up with this example that your work ethic could carry you through, and that you can make something out of nothing, and that you work with what you have. And I think that that's true of even my writing practice today. I never throw anything away. I never take for granted any opportunity. I believe that you deal with what's in front of you and that you make the most of that. So all of those things were incredibly useful when I was learning to become a writer.
Did they think you were dropped on their doorstep in an alien pod? Are you the black sheep bohemian who sort of went to the city?
I probably am the black sheep, yeah. It's very hard to know what other people think of you or make of you. I think I was probably one of those women who was maybe silent for a long time, and I think Irish women can be a bit like that. We've got incredible resilience and inner strength, and that can be maybe not seen or visible on the outside for quite a long time. And then I imagine my parents turned around at some point and thought, oh my God, we've raised this kind of machine who is determined now, to go on this writing journey. And
it sounds very kind of Southern Gothic, Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers sort of, here's the keeper of the stories.
Yeah. I love Flannery O'Connor.
She's a badass.
Yeah.
You've spoken about the boglands in Donegal as almost a sort of aboriginal, mystical place in which to grow up.
Yeah, it's very, very strange growing up in the bog, the bright black boglands. I learned so much there about sound and silence and what might be buried in darkness and what can get sucked into darkness and what can be the bog is constantly untwisting things back out of itself. So, like, you're all the time being swallowed and you're all the time being kind of regurgitated back. And that was a very, that particular bogland in northwest Donegal, it's steeped in mythology and folklore and Christian narratives, for better and for worse. I grew up in this landscape which was shaped and embedded with all these male narratives, and there was a richness to that, and yet there was also, the thinking began to form in me. I want to reimagine this landscape. I want to write this Donegal landscape, but I want to write it, through the female story. I want to kind of reclaim it a bit, and it's something I'm thinking more and more about, reclaiming the landscape and showing it in a different light. And I grew up around the hill that I grew up in. It was associated with Columkill, and then there were stories of the Fomorians, who are these sea creatures, kind of one-eyed sea creatures, and all of the kings were male, and I'd struggled to have thought of any part of the landscape which was really associated with a female story, and so all of that was really important to look at, I think, when I started to write.
Do you have a poem that you'd like to read along those themes?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I might read a poem that was written for my foster sisters. Fosterage is something that I'm thinking about a lot because it was part of my own life, but it's also a really old part of Gaelic culture, and under Brehon law was kind of a really important way of understanding how society was organised. And so in this poem I've drawn from my own life experiences, but I have given each sister the name of a powerful female figure from Ireland's mythological or historical past. Sisters. Let it be said, I cut a nick in my own skin, and by a spit became blooded to them all. Maeve swaddled in clean cloth like a gem, as her mother, aged 16, leaned against the kitchen counter and watched me hold. Breege and Marie, found in a trailer by the river, speaking in a twisted song. Emer, who was always going home. Niamh, who I was wild for and who was wild for me, but who held me under in the pool until both of us were dragged out of the water sobbing. Dara, who pulled her shirt up to reveal a string of roses on her ribs. Here are the gifts of my father, she said. Grace, who could fix any error with a piece of purple gum. Sarah, pure as water, bold as fire. I can still see her tear across the hill on that guy's motorbike, high-headed and ready for battle. Tailed women, denim stealers, alley girls in white musk with 9 lives, these were my sisters. We argued over top bunks, we bled on sheets, we were 4 in a room the winter the house was falling down. We wrote letters to the man on the radio. We scanned the news for names of the dead. We curled letters inside bottles and threw them out to sea. We snapped wishbones, swore on graves, buried our treasure. We swung the gold of our mothers over our palms 3 times and asked the air, will I be loved? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no?
I love that is so steeped in your own mythology, in Irish mythology, but the litany effect is almost sort of like Beat Generation. It's almost got that sort of footnote to hell, scriptural botanical thing going on. I was surprised to see you spent quite a while in Jack Kerouac's house in Florida. Do you believe
special.
houses have a residue of people who lived in them?
Absolutely. I think that the landscape carries often stories that keep coming back to us because they need to be made sense of. And so houses carry stories, sites, ruins, monuments, place names as well can also be a signpost into how the physical environment carries the unsaid things that keep niggling at us. And how amazing to spend time in Kerouac's house, in his armchair, and to kind of look out over the same street that he looked out over. And yet I was keenly aware that it's Kerouac's house, but really it's Gabriella's house, his mother, who paid the bills and cleaned up after he had a party and took him in and held the space together. It was her house, and so much she put it, she really kind of created that space and made it possible for him to be the writer that he was whilst there. So it became the kind of running joke that I would say, well, it's not Jack's house, it's his ma's house.
Well, it's an interesting thing because all the beats, Burroughs, Kerouac, and later on Bukowski, whose work I think some of which you like has that 1950s machismo male energy. Very much the women in the stories of the Beat generation are quote-unquote housewives or girlfriends who've been left behind, or the sort of domestic forces who are forever, tethering the unbridled sort of energy of the artist. And it's that's an interesting way of getting in there is through Jack's mother.
Yeah. Well, I think we go back and we go back and we go back to what we need to understand. I mean, I come from a family where, my grandmother was silenced. She was sent off for several months to deal with the situation of being pregnant and told not to come home until she had resolved that situation. And a lot of the children that I grew up with as well, they were erased out of their families because there were problems there. I mean, I don't know why we have the system where we remove children a lot of the time instead of removing problems from families. And so I suppose it's, going towards the beats, and Kerouac is again going towards a landscape where, women were not being heard or were being pushed slightly to the fringes, and trying to make sense of that. And that's something I think I'll be making sense of all during my life, really. What happens when we silence women and we don't listen to their stories and experiences.
What age were you when you first spoke English?
Irish was my first language up until about 3, and then I went to school, so I suppose I had more exposure then to people speaking English, and so I suppose around 4 I really started speaking English.
Which would you consider, do you still consider Irish your native tongue, your first language?
I consider Irish the heart language, and it's one with which I have a complicated relationship, I think, because I haven't always felt comfortable writing in Irish, and that's for a variety of reasons. One being I never had the opportunity to read widely in Irish during my formative years. Also, it's a new level of intimacy, I think, with the subject. Think of Irish as the heart language, and there's a lot. It comes with a lot of history. It's the language that I first spoke with the people that I was closest to in my family, and it was one that was interrupted, really ultimately interrupted by the state, because when we started to foster children, we started then having to speak more and more English to accommodate more and more people in the home. So, like, there was some kind of trauma there, I think, with English coming into the home through social worker reports and counsellors and authorities and guards and people arriving in the middle of the night. And, you know, I have a very emotional relationship with language and with Irish, and feeling that I lost my grip of the Irish language under the influence of the state a little bit, you know. And it's really now in my 30s that I'm looking at that and thinking I'm just going to start writing. You know, I'm writing bilingual poems now. I'm using more Irish. I'm coming back into my Irish language history.
Just like being colonised all over again, except by the state.
It's very, I mean, yeah, it's very, like, I feel like I lost a bit of my confidence to use my own heart language, which seems very shocking, you know, but that's what happened. That's what happens. I mean, I was listening to an interview recently with Moya Brennan from Clannad, and she was saying that when they first began in their hometown, which is very close to where I grew up, singing their songs in Irish, people didn't necessarily approve. You know, they thought it was a bit ridiculous, kind of putting your heart language on show. Also, Irish is, you know, where I come from, it has been the language of hardship and of poverty and of struggle and of sorrow. And so even for me, there seemed something like it was a big step. It's a big step now to put the Irish language down on the page and to, you know, put that out there, that part of myself, that part of hardship and struggle and survival out there. So sometimes people come to the Gaeltacht in Donegal, and I think they don't always have positive experiences trying to speak Irish and wondering why people don't speak Irish back. Mm-hmm. But where I come from, Irish is the language of a small, tight-knit community which has gone through very hard times. And so to be, you know, singing your songs or writing your poems in it is almost showing a part of yourself that seems private.
It sounds almost like the relationship African Americans would have with blues.
Right.
That it's it's an indigenous language, but it's associated with great hardship and deprivation.
Yeah.
So it makes people uncomfortable, until there's enough distance put between it and you can appreciate it. I always wondered this: if at a time when you were speaking both languages, do you have a sense of dreaming in different languages? Mm-hmm. Is a dream different if it's in Irish than it is in English? Listen,
you're completely. I really believe we're completely different people in different languages. You know, I'm in the English language. You know, my interface with the world tends to be somebody who's a little bit kind of maybe introverted and a little bit kind of formal on the page. And in Irish, I have a totally different sense of humour. I have a totally different way of building relationships with people. Like it's a different lens completely. We're different people in different languages. I really believe that.
Irish language has a particular way of being bawdy without being crude.
Very much so. It's like sarcasm doesn't quite cover it, but there's a sense of humour in the Irish language where you can get away with a lot in Irish that you would never... I would say things in Irish I would never dream of saying in English because they would just seem crass or uncouth. But in the Irish language...
Test us.
I won't. You're a bit freer when speaking Irish.
So you were a teenager when, in the 90s?
90s, yeah.
What's your memory of writing something or having any kind of breakthrough in terms of language? Are there dead novels under the bed? Was it always poetry? What was, do you have a memory of actually getting a thrill?
I think for me it will always be poetry. I do other things. I teach in a variety of settings. I'm writing an opera libretto. I'm interested in memoir. But essentially, as a poet, you're an obsessive person. You're somebody who loves tinkering, dismantling. It's like somebody taking apart a radio and putting it back together again. You want to take everything apart and see how it works and put it back together again. And I suppose I just always had that sensitivity. I wanted to always dig into something and see, well, how far down can I go with this digging and what's at the root or the source? And for me, that marks poets out as being a little bit different to other types of writers. And I suppose that sensitivity was always there. But a kind of magic thing happened in the 90s. Two poets, James Simmons and his wife Janice Fitzpatrick Simmons, who ran the Poets' House in Belfast, which was a very esteemed school, and it was affiliated, I think it ran an MA in affiliation with, anyway, university in the UK. But they had to pack up out of Northern Ireland in the 90s, and here they arrived down to the foot of Errigal in the Donegal-born. And writers travelled from all over the world to attend the Poets' House. It was a very attractive venue for all the, literary greats, because who doesn't want to go to the Donegal-born to the end of, it was really appealing and hear the language being spoken and be beside the coast. And so I was 14 or 15 and I met Jimmy Simmons, and he said, hey, come up to the Poets' House for a workshop. And had my first workshop with Leyland Bardwell, and it just was a complete game changer as a teenager, because here was a woman sitting in front of me who she had, not only did she have a voice unlike any other voice I'd heard, and she was listening and she was talking about the craft of writing, but she also was leading a kind of life that I had not been around before in rural northwest Donegal, where people were very assigned into their gender roles, to some degree. So I had that workshop with Leyland Bardwell, and I just thought that this is the life I want, which is a life of writing and interrogation and poking at things and taking them apart and putting them back together.
I remember Mike McCormick once described a bunch of stories that he was working on to me as a breaker's yard. I thought that was a wonderful way of describing this breaker's yard of stories in various states of disrepair. There's something in that. I remember reading a biography of Robert Lowell when I was about 24, and then later a biography of William Burroughs. And what struck me is that they all had these lives that were almost like the lives you had to lead if you're going to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that struck me about it was there's a horrendous amount of pain involved.
Mm. Yep.
Is that something you're doomed? Is that something you're doomed to fulfill if you're a writer, Annemarie?
I'm really interested in constellations within communities and constellations within a family, and like we've all seen it lands to one person to look after the parents, it lands to one person to arrange the celebrations, and sometimes it lands to one person to do the feeling as well. And writers or artists can often end up in that situation where they're doing a lot of feeling. And that means that there's a lot of joy in writing a book, and there's definitely a lot of painful feelings as well, I think.
Is there a lot of neurosis involved?
Yeah. I don't know, I need to think about that, because poetry is a trade and it's a craft, and I'm not quite sure I buy into the suffering artist myth, because going back to what I said earlier on, I believe in the enterprise of work and labour, and that ethic can carry a book or a voice or a writer a long way.
That's not to discount that there are neurotic mechanics or farmers or horse breeders.
Yes, I suppose there is. I mean, it's you're constantly. When I had finished writing Bloodroot, I felt like a skin had been taken off, and that I was really kind of raw, and So who does that? I mean, is it advisable? Like somebody said to me recently, is poetry healing? I just thought it's not always very good at healing. Like sometimes your job is to peel off a skin
in public,
in public, and to go to that neurotic place and be that person.
Well, I suppose the flip side of that is you do a lot of work teaching in prisons.
Yes, yeah.
So, assuming that helps, how does it help? Is it men's prisons, women's prisons?
Both, actually.
Okay.
I've done both, yeah. Yeah, I probably out of all of the teaching that I do, teaching in prisons is the work that is probably most nourishing, in that you go into a prison and you're faced in a bare way with people who are being held there, but also with yourself, you know. So sometimes you see the worst and also the best of humanity. You see everything in its full glory when you go into a prison. When I'm teaching in prison, it feels like everything that you would ordinarily feel in a workshop is magnified. So when you really connect with someone in a prison setting, it can be life-changing. And when somebody is pushing you away in a workshop, or not listening, or doesn't want to listen, or turning away from the work, that can be really extreme. So
that's a lot of responsibility either ways.
But I think as a poet, you always have responsibility. Once you put words on a page, and especially if you're writing history, you really have to. I'm always thinking about poetry and responsibility, and how do I write from a mindful place, and how do I make poems that are going to have some transformative quality. And you mentioned consequence there. There's always a consequence, to using your voice, and especially speaking about the things that I speak of. And so the prison work is just an extension of that. You really have to face into it with the full awareness that students who are coming to your workshop, they might be, waiting all day, all week, all month to come to this workshop and to say something that they have been carrying for a very long time. And you have to be ready that you're going to give them the opportunity, you're going to show them how they can work with personal material and how they can craft a poem, and that you're also going, by the time you leave, something transformative has happened, and that it's also that you're being safe and that you're being responsible. And I just see that as an extension of writing about, Ann Lovett's story or Joanne Hayes. It's all part of the same. It's all part of the same work.
Were you apprehensive before entering that environment for the first time?
Definitely. I mean, who wouldn't be apprehensive about stepping into a building and going through all the security checks, and once those barred doors close, and you're going to be met with people and they don't know you and you don't know them, and you're all in this very intense setting. But I've always found that once you get into the writing of poems and the craft of it, all of that falls away. I've never felt unsafe in a prison, actually. What I have felt is harrowed by the grief and the sorrow, and then also just so moved by the human spirit and by the hope that we will have, even in the most adverse circumstances. To get yourself out of bed in a cold prison in the depths of winter and carrying all your loss and everything else you might be feeling, and to get yourself down to a table and to start, maybe with minimal literacy skills, trying to write. You really see the human spirit in its full glory, and it's sometimes, you go back out into the ordinary world and you think, like, we're not really listening to each other and we're not seeing each other, because you've had such an intense experience with a student who is maybe writing for the first time, naming something to themselves for the first time, listening to somebody else beside them and their story and connecting for the first time. Like, it's an honour to bear witness to that kind of writing.
Has prison flattened out these people, made them into a kind of person, or is it as disparate as it is out here?
I think it's, in many ways, like any other setting. You meet people from all walks of life. I suppose one of the things that I've learned is that a crime is in somebody's life is it's something that happens in the context of many different events. Usually, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and that we can't be the question is there, like, should we be defined by the very awful things that we do, or is it up to me to create a space where somebody can, for a moment, be aligned with the good and pure part of themselves, which is the creative part and the human spirit. Like, it's not difficult for me to empathise in a prison setting at all with anyone who comes to my table, because we're here to write a poem and we're here to work with whatever. Again, it's go back to that thing, we'll work with what we have, we'll work with what's in front of us. As harrowing, as sorrowful as that may be, or as off the wall, or as unclear in your mind, we're going to spend this hour and we're going to make something that is transformative. And it's a very rich process.
I spoke to a writer once who taught Iraq veterans in Michigan. And when speaking to older teachers, he said that the generation returning from Iraq were more damaged than the generation returning from Vietnam, because the Vietnam generation had some tradition of verbalizing or writing what they'd seen and what they'd experienced, no matter what their class or their background. But that a lot of the men, mostly coming back from Iraq, had been raised on hip-hop and porn and video games, and they literally didn't have the language to describe or vocalize what they'd experienced, and so the sense of trauma and blockage was so much greater. And I'm wondering just about the role of language in being able to tap the wound.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel very passionate about, is that we know things in the Irish language. We know, we have knowledge and we have wisdom and we have capacity, unique capacity for healing and for moving past and beyond trauma. And when we lose the language, we lose a lot of those skills and capabilities, and they have to be learned over again in the English language.
What's the best case scenario of teaching a prisoner?
Ultimately, what I want to do is I want the student to realise that they have a voice, and that that voice is where all poetry begins and comes from, and that they too have the potential to use their voice to transform life experience into poems and to engage with the craft of writing. So, there are two parts, I think, to creating a poem. There's the instinctual kind of flooding the page with your feeling or your memory or your emotion, and then there's the second, technical bit where you're shaping and tinkering and moving a thing into place. And so I'm really trying to talk to a prisoner about all of that, and to give them a moment where they can come to the table, and I don't know what they've done. I don't want to know what they've done. I want them to bring this pure part of themselves and to work with it, which is what I try to do when I sit down to write.
you're operating in an interesting time, which is there for about 10 or 15 years. We have such a rich kind of poetic tradition in this country. But somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 2000 and 2010, there was this sense that either poetry wasn't being written by a certain generation, the stuff that was being written was somehow irrelevant or belonged to another world, another time. There wasn't a sense of vitality and regeneration going on. And then all of a sudden, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's you, there's Doireann Ní Churreáin, there's Dave Lorden, there's Jessica Traynor, there's Colm Keegan, all kinds of both written and performance poets. Mm-hmm. What do you think happened? What triggered it?
Well, especially for female Irish poets, there's almost a direct relationship between the new visibility of younger female Irish poets and what they're talking about and the shifting landscape in Ireland. You know, 2 recent big referendums. There's new permission now, I think, to as a female poet to step forward and to be heard and to talk about all of those things that historically we have pushed under the carpet. So I think you can almost look at poetry before kind of, 2018 and after, and you can see a marked change in what happens when you like just taking for one example of a change, the repeal the 8th referendum, and like poetry is, well, for me anyway, it's a visual experience, it's an oral experience, but it's a bodily one. Poetry, I write a lot about the body, I feel poetry in the body, I'm thinking a lot about rhythm and silence, and that as a bodily experience. And to have this legislation now that says your body is your body to make decisions about, of course that has an impact for writers. Of course that has an impact for poets. Poets in particular, like our first rhythm that we hear is the mother's heartbeat, so we're rhythmic creatures, we're poetic creatures. We love rhyme, we love, and so there's been such a change now where we're saying in Ireland that, with both referendums, that your body is yours now. We're giving it kind of back. And I think that you suddenly see all these female poets and writers now becoming more, it's like a veil has been pulled back, and you're seeing much more visibility, and I feel really honoured to be part of that generation, but a very exciting time to be a female poet in Ireland, absolutely.
As though the times have demanded it.
I think so, yeah.
Annemarie, thanks very much for being a guest on Sid Murphy's podcast.
Thank you.